And we return to the great debate over budgets, deficits, taxes, and spending with yet another viewpoint, this one with some historical perspective. NewsHour economics correspondent Paul Solman is on the case, part of his ongoing reporting, Making Sense of Financial News.
Our allegedly tragic trillion-dollar annual budget deficits, swelling our supposedly unsustainable $16 trillion national debt. More borrowing, it said, means the proverbial road to ruin. Some think then that the fiscal cliff, slashed spending and hiked taxes, is not the horror of horrors, some sort of economic suicide, but the very opposite, the last resort for avoiding a fatal whirlpool of debt. So what about more debt? Will it destroy us or won't it? How bad would it be to barrel over the cliff? Enter former IMF chief economist Simon Johnson of MIT. He's written a book, White House Burning, on the history of U.S. debt, all 225 years of it, its whys and wherefores, and get this, its considerable virtues. We asked if he could provide a TV version. The answer was a mobile history lesson. Starting at the museum, where every 15 minutes they reenact the dumping that helped make a town famous and a group of contentious colonies united.
So to begin, here in Boston, what's your fundamental thesis?
The American Republic is born partially in a tax revolt. This is the Tea Party site where they threw the tea over because they didn't like the tax system. So this has been a fundamental debate and argument from the beginning of the American Republic. And then we come back today to exactly the same sorts of issues.
Friends, brethren, countrymen!
Well, not exactly the same.
The detested tea!
The Tea Partiers of yore included tea smugglers, protesting England having lowered the tax on tea, threatening their contraband business. But hey, as between legend and fact, legend usually wins. And the fact is, as between paying now or paying later, Americans have just about always preferred debt to taxes. Debt to pay the very first army, for example. This is the spot on the Cambridge Common where, legend has it, General Washington first amassed his troops under a now dead elm and faced the basic question of government economics.
How is he going to pay them? How is he going to feed them? How is he going to clothe them? Where are they going to get their shoes? That's the question, Paul, we're still trying to answer. How do we tax ourselves? And what's a reasonable amount of federal government spending and on what?
What did America in the making do? We didn't much tax ourselves. Instead, we began to borrow as a new, united country.
It was the idea primarily of Alexander Hamilton, who was the first Secretary of the Treasury under George Washington. Hamilton realized you needed to have strong federal fiscal authority, the ability to tax, and the ability to issue debt and manage debt and bring debt down.
We also stiffed creditors back then, too.
Absolutely. The United States was born in default. We defaulted on many obligations to foreign creditors and to our own soldiers.
Okay, so America was born and swaddled in debt. Then, about 77 years later, when the country threatened to break in two, it was borrowing that distinguished the winners from the losers.
In the Civil War, the North financed itself by issuing bonds and by developing a tax system. Nobody was very happy about that, but it worked. The South financed itself by printing money and got a hyperinflation, further destabilizing its economy. So those are two different ways to finance a big ramp up in government activity. And the North won, in part because they had a better approach, the Hamilton approach to public finance.
And that approach was to print IOUs, bonds, and come up with a way to market them, mainly in Europe, to people who had the money and thought, hey, I'm going to get it back with a good rate of interest.
They also sold them to what we now call retail investors. They made the bonds relatively small denominations and had a big marketing push. The first time anybody in this country or almost anywhere else had tried to sell bonds to ordinary, regular people. Big success.
And so it was, says Johnson, whenever America found itself at war. Peaks of debt, as a percentage of the national economy, at the peak of every conflagration from the Revolution through the War of 1812 and the Civil War to World War I. The next big bump in debt added a new reason to borrow. It came during peacetime. New debt to combat the Great Depression of the 1930s that hit America and other market economies.
Massive slump in GDP and output, and conventional economics and standard economic practice just didn't work for turning these economies around.
Now, had you been born, you would have been in England at the time, and that was when John Maynard Keynes became most famous for his prescription, spend, spend, spend. That's how you get the system up and moving again, by pouring money into it.
Yes, when you're in depression. So in that situation, Keynes said that more government spending could help push the economy, restart the private sector by having the government lead the way.
And when J.M. Keynes talked, people listened. Among them, Johnson's academic predecessors.
People working here at MIT Department of Economics and in other leading universities became convinced that the government could play a different role and a more helpful role in the economy and supporting the macroeconomy compared to what the previous orthodoxy had been before the 1930s.
But that meant going into more and more debt, and that's a good thing then, you say.
It meant being careful with the debt still. It meant that deficit spending was something that could be very useful to you in turn when the economy needs some help.
Very useful, and of course borrowing proved very necessary when World War II broke out. Total U.S. debt soared to 120% of GDP. But after the war, the U.S. economy soared too. And by the late 1960s, economic growth had whittled the percentage down near 40% of GDP, despite new wars on poverty and Vietnam. Again, debt had delivered us from evil, and it seemed, into prosperity. Then came the 1980s, and the tax cuts of Ronald Reagan, combined with greater defense spending, leading to hugely higher annual deficits covered by borrowing, and thus again a swelling national debt, but with no wars at all. Then, under Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, we took action. For a while, both parties agreed, says Simon Johnson.
And there was a bipartisan agreement to raise revenue and put something of a damper on spending. So that's an important moment. In the bigger picture, of course, that was just a small hesitation on the path to a much larger national debt.
Because in the bigger picture, a president just can't accomplish very much if he's cutting spending and won't raise taxes. And so, yet again, more borrowing under Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Higher deficits and debt that, because of the graying baby boom, are fated to get even worse.
The population was always going to age. The baby boomers were going to retire. They were paying a lot of Social Security contributions in the 1990s. They're drawing pensions today. We were always going to shift into structural deficit for that reason.
And that's why, even though we've been in deeper hock before as a percentage of the economy, this time really may be different. With the baby boom hanging it up, increasing our debt load now presents a clear and future danger. And thus, this era's key questions.
Do you want to keep Social Security? Do you want to keep Medicare? And if yes, how are you going to pay for it? And I don't suggest the answer be, we'll sell more debt to the Chinese. You've got to pay the taxes to support the social insurance programs if that's what you want to keep.
But Americans do not want to pay higher taxes.
No one wants to pay higher taxes. Actually, everyone's happy to have someone else pay higher taxes. They don't want to pay higher taxes themselves. And this is where we come to in the conversation. What do you want government to do? And we got ourselves into this mindset of, well, the government can give me some stuff, but someone else can pay for it. That's incredibly dangerous. That is what has broken many governments and many countries. It's never been the American problem, but it is the American problem today.
Last stop, back to Cambridge Common. Last point, some people think going over the cliff won't be all that catastrophic. But economist Simon Johnson thinks it would be a disaster. You don't just change course overnight.
If you go over the cliff in a disorganized way with mass amount of political confrontation, that could be very bad for us and much worse for the world. We need to make some fiscal adjustments. Some of those things include higher revenue and bringing spending under control. So I'm in favor of that. But charging off a cliff as we struggle at each other's throats, very bad.
Very bad, perhaps, but not, as things now stand, impossible to imagine.